Millionaire needs a fake wife for his brother's wedding. He's shocked at how beautiful she is. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. He was a man used to control, wealth, and power. In the towering skyline of New York City, Alexander Pierce was known as a self-made millionaire, the type of man whose sharp suits and sharper words could intimidate even the most seasoned businessmen. Yet on this particular evening, his polished exterior carried a weight he rarely allowed anyone to see. His younger brother's wedding was only 2 weeks away, and Alexander had been reminded over and over by his family that it would not look proper for him to arrive alone. A Pierce man, especially the eldest, had to uphold appearances. A successful businessman without a wife, or at least a serious partner? To his traditional family, that was unacceptable. At first, he tried to brush it off. He had always been too busy building his empire to think of marriage. Love was for dreamers, he told himself. But the pressure was relentless. His mother dropped hints with every phone call. His father gave him the stern look of disappointment at dinner. His brother's fiancée, radiant with excitement, teased him about being the last single man in the family. Each comment carved deeper into him until he realized he had to do something drastic. That was when the idea struck him. Not love, not a real relationship, but an arrangement, a contract, a temporary solution to silence the whispers and keep the family satisfied. All he needed was someone convincing enough to play the role of his wife during the wedding festivities. Nothing more, nothing less. The search led him to a coffee shop tucked away on a quiet corner of Brooklyn. It was the kind of place where the smell of fresh pastries lingered in the air, and the tables were filled with students studying, artists sketching, and tired workers trying to escape the noise of the city. That was where he saw her for the first time. Her name was Emily Carter. She was not dressed to impress. No luxury brands or polished jewelry. Instead, she wore a simple blouse, faded jeans, and a soft cardigan that looked as though it had been washed 100 times. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and strands framed her face as she scribbled something into a worn notebook. There was nothing extraordinary at first glance, yet when Alexander's gaze lingered, he noticed the way her eyes shone with quiet determination, the kind of fire that came from enduring struggles no one else could see. Emily was not looking for a millionaire. She was working long hours, saving every dollar to cover her mother's hospital bills at St. Mary's Hospital. The debt weighed heavily on her, and her worn notebook was filled not with poetry or dreams, but with calculations of how many shifts she would need to survive another month. That night, as the rain tapped against the windows of the cafe, she closed her eyes for just a moment, exhaustion painted across her features. Alexander watched her with a calculating mind. She was not part of his world, and that was exactly why she could fit the role. No one in his circles knew her. She was ordinary, invisible, but there was a grace in her presence that could disarm suspicion. He approached her table, his footsteps echoing in the small shop. "Emily Carter?" he asked, surprising her. She looked up, startled. "Do I know you?" "No," he said smoothly, sliding into the chair across from her without waiting for permission. "But I know that you need money. And I need a wife. A temporary one." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Excuse me?" Alexander leaned forward, his eyes steady, his tone deliberate. "This is not a proposal of romance. It is a business arrangement. You pretend to be my wife for 2 weeks. You attend my brother's wedding, smile at my relatives, and play the role convincingly. In exchange, you will receive enough to cover all of your mother's medical expenses for the rest of the year." The words hung in the air, sharp and unbelievable. Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. Was this man serious? Her heart pounded as she weighed the absurdity of his offer against the crushing reality of her mother's illness. She wanted to laugh, to dismiss him as arrogant and insane. And yet, a part of her whispered, what if this was the miracle she had been praying for? Outside, the rain grew heavier, streaking down the windows like silent tears. Inside, 2 strangers sat at a small wooden table, one desperate for dignity, the other desperate for love disguised as a contract. Neither of them could predict that what began as a lie would set into motion a story that would test their pride, break their hearts, and force them to confront the truth about what it meant to love. And so, the arrangement began. Emily Carter sat frozen in her chair, the sound of the rain outside muffled compared to the storm raging inside her chest. She studied the man across from her, this millionaire who had just spoken words so outrageous they felt surreal. Alexander Pierce's expression was steady, as if he had simply asked her to pass the sugar, not to marry him under false pretenses. Her lips parted, but the words tangled before escaping. Finally, she managed, "You cannot be serious." Alexander did not flinch. "I am absolutely serious. I am a man who does not waste time. I require a wife for 2 weeks. You require financial stability. I believe we can help each other." Emily shook her head, clutching her notebook like a shield. "That is insane. People do not just hire wives." A faint smirk touched his lips. "People hire actors. People hire stand-ins. This is no different. Only the role you will be playing carries more weight." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Emily, I am not asking you to love me. I am asking you to play a part." The way he said her name sent a shiver through her. How did he even know who she was? She asked the question aloud. "I did my research," he admitted without hesitation. "I know about your mother. I know about the mounting bills at St. Mary's Hospital. I know you are one shift away from collapse. I can solve that for you." Her face burned with anger and humiliation. "So you think because you are rich, you can buy my life, my dignity?" His eyes narrowed, but his tone stayed calm. "No. I think because I am pragmatic, I can offer you a solution when the world has given you none. You can refuse, and your mother continues to suffer while you drown in debt. Or you can accept, and she receives the best care money can provide. The choice is yours." Emily wanted to scream at him, to walk out of that cafe and never look back. Yet his words struck at the deepest part of her heart, the place that carried her mother's fragile smile and trembling hands. Every sleepless night spent working double shifts, every tear shed in silence at the sight of unpaid bills, this man had laid it all bare on the table. Her voice cracked. "And what happens after the wedding?" Alexander's expression softened only slightly. "After 2 weeks, the contract ends. You walk away with a clean slate and enough money to start over. No strings, no obligations, just freedom." Freedom. The word echoed in her chest like a forbidden dream. She thought of her mother, of the hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic, of the nurses who always looked at her with pity. She thought of the stack of bills on her kitchen counter. And she thought of herself, trapped in a cycle that seemed unbreakable. She met his eyes, searching for any trace of cruelty. But what she saw unsettled her even more. Determination. Yes. Arrogance. Certainly. But also something deeper, hidden behind layers of control. It was as if he needed this charade as much as she did, though for entirely different reasons. "Why me?" she whispered. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Because you are ordinary. No connections to my world. No agenda. You are invisible to the people who would question me. And," his gaze lingered on her face, "because you carry yourself with more strength than most people in my circles. They will believe you are my choice." The cafe seemed to shrink around them, every sound fading until there was only the pounding of her heart. She knew this was reckless, dangerous even. Yet her options were few, and her mother's life weighed heavier than pride. 2 weeks, she said slowly, testing the words as if they were poison. "And after that, I walk away free." Alexander inclined his head. 2 weeks. And freedom. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a crisp stack of papers. Emily stared at them, stunned. "You came prepared?" "Of course," he replied. "I do not believe in chance meetings. I believe in plans." The rain outside slowed, the storm easing into a quiet drizzle. Emily stared at the contract, her hand trembling as she reached for the pen. Somewhere deep inside, every instinct screamed at her to run. But louder still was the voice of love for her mother, the voice that begged her to endure anything if it meant saving her. She signed her name. And just like that, Emily Carter's fate was sealed with ink on paper. She had become the fake wife of Alexander Pierce, never knowing that this agreement, born of desperation, would unravel both of their lives in ways they could not yet imagine. The following weekend arrived with a quiet intensity. Emily Carter found herself seated in the back of a sleek black car, the kind she had only seen in movies. The city blurred by outside the tinted windows, as the driver carried her toward a future she could not quite believe she had agreed to. The papers were signed. The deal was real. And now, there was no turning back. Beside her, Alexander Pierce looked as composed as ever, his expression carved in stone. He wore another impeccably tailored suit, the kind that announced his wealth before he spoke a single word. He held his phone loosely in his hand, scanning through emails, barely glancing at her. The silence pressed heavy between them, until Emily finally broke it. "So what exactly do I do when we arrive?" she asked, her voice tight. Alexander slipped the phone into his pocket and turned his gaze on her. "You do what any wife would do. You smile, you stay by my side, you answer questions politely but vaguely, and most importantly, you convince them that we are real." Emily swallowed hard. "And if I make a mistake, then I correct it," he replied without hesitation. "But I would prefer you did not make one. My family is sharp. They will test you. They will search for cracks in our story." Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. She had agreed to this, yes, but the weight of it now settled over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "What if they ask how we met?" His eyes flickered with amusement. "Then you tell them the truth. We met in a coffee shop. You will leave out the part where I offered you a contract." Emily shot him a glare, but he only smirked. The car pulled into a long driveway lined with trimmed hedges and stone lamps. Ahead stood the Pierce family estate, a mansion that looked like it had been plucked from another century and polished to perfection. As the car rolled to a stop, Emily's pulse quickened. This was no casual introduction. This was her first test. The driver opened her door, and the cool air hit her face. She stepped out onto the gravel path, her simple dress fluttering around her knees. Alexander was instantly at her side, offering his arm. She hesitated for only a second, before slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. Inside the grand foyer, crystal chandeliers glowed above, and the polished marble floor reflected the light like water. Servants moved briskly, carrying trays of champagne. A small crowd of well-dressed relatives turned their heads as Alexander entered with Emily at his side. Conversations faltered. Eyes widened. Whispers began. Alexander leaned slightly toward her, his voice low. "Remember, confidence. You belong here as much as anyone." The words steadied her more than she expected. She lifted her chin and forced her steps to match his. "Alexander!" a voice called out. A tall woman with sharp features and perfectly styled hair swept toward them. Emily recognized her immediately as his mother. The woman's eyes narrowed as they flicked to Emily. "And who is this?" Alexander's grip on Emily's hand tightened just enough for her to notice. "Mother, this is my wife, Emily." The room seemed to inhale at once. A ripple of shock passed through the gathering. His mother's eyes widened, then narrowed again. "Your wife? Since when?" Emily's stomach knotted, but she remembered his words, confidence. She smiled softly and said, "Since earlier this year, we decided to keep it private until now." "Oh." The lie slid off her tongue smoother than she expected, her voice steady. Alexander's mother stared at her for a long moment, then forced a brittle smile. "How interesting. Welcome, Emily." It was not a warm welcome, but it was survival. Emily knew this was only the beginning. The evening passed in a blur of introductions. Cousins, uncles, business partners. Each one asked questions with polite smiles and watchful eyes. How did they meet? How long had they been together? What did Emily do for work? She answered carefully, weaving half-truths with small pieces of herself. She told them about her love of reading, about working in a small cafe, about enjoying quiet mornings with coffee. And when Alexander's aunt raised an eyebrow and said, "You do not seem like his usual type," Emily met her gaze directly and said, "That is because I am not a type. I am his wife." The words silenced the table, and for the first time, Alexander's lips curved into something that almost looked like admiration. By the end of the night, Emily's legs ached, her face hurt from smiling, and her nerves were frayed. But she had survived. She had played the part. She had passed the first test. As they returned to the car, Alexander opened the door for her. When she slipped inside, he followed and sat in silence for a moment before speaking. "You did well," he said simply. Emily let out a shaky breath, the tension finally breaking. "I felt like I was drowning." His eyes lingered on her face. "And yet you swam." The car pulled away from the estate, and for the first time since this arrangement began, Emily felt a flicker of something unexpected. Not just relief, not just exhaustion, but a spark of pride and a dangerous awareness that this charade was already beginning to feel far too real. The following days unfolded like a carefully staged performance. Emily Carter found herself immersed in a world that did not belong to her, a world of tailored suits, grand estates, and glittering banquets. She had thought the contract would be simple: show up, smile, play the role of a wife, but nothing about Alexander Pierce's life was simple. Every morning began with another lesson in presentation. Alexander insisted on precision. "Walk beside me, not behind me. People will notice if you seem timid. A wife of mine does not cower." His tone was sharp, but beneath it Emily sensed something else, a strange desire for her to succeed, as though her performance mattered to him personally, not just for appearances. In the evenings, they rehearsed details, dates, memories, shared experiences they had to memorize to keep their story intact. They practiced how they supposedly met. The first time he introduced her to his favorite restaurant. The day he gave her a necklace she now wore around her neck. The necklace itself was not hers. It had been selected from a collection in his safe, an accessory turned into a prop for their act. At first, Emily stumbled over the lies. She felt clumsy and out of place. But Alexander corrected her with relentless patience, drilling her until her answers flowed as naturally as the truth. Somewhere between the repetition and the exhaustion, the false memories began to blur with her real ones, weaving into a tapestry she could almost believe. One evening, after a particularly long rehearsal, Emily sank into the couch in his penthouse living room. The walls of glass framed the New York skyline, glittering against the night. She hugged a throw pillow to her chest, her eyes heavy with fatigue. "You are too tense," Alexander said from across the room. He poured himself a glass of wine, then poured one for her as well. "Relax. If you look nervous, they will sense it." "I'll." Emily accepted the glass, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. The contact startled her more than it should have. She sipped the wine and looked at him, trying to pierce through the armor he always wore. "How do you do it? Live every day under so much scrutiny, so many expectations?" He leaned back in his chair, the faintest trace of vulnerability flickering across his face. "You learn to hide. You become who they expect you to be. And eventually, you forget who you were in the first place." The honesty in his words left her silent. For the first time, she saw not just the cold businessman, but a man who carried burdens heavier than his wealth. The next day, the rehearsals turned into reality. They attended a charity gala together, their first major appearance as husband and wife beyond the family circle. The ballroom glowed with golden chandeliers, and every eye turned to watch as Alexander Pierce entered with Emily on his arm. Her heart pounded, but she remembered his words. Confidence. She stood tall, smiled gracefully, and allowed the whispers to wash over her. Reporters snapped photos. Socialites leaned close to gossip. A rival businessman's wife whispered just loud enough, "She looks so plain for him." Emily's cheeks burned, but she kept her smile steady. Later, when the music swelled and couples moved to the dance floor, Alexander extended his hand. "Shall we, Mrs. Pierce?" Her stomach tightened at the title, but she placed her hand in his. The orchestra played a slow waltz, and Alexander guided her with effortless grace. At first she stumbled, her nerves betraying her, but he whispered, "Look at me, forget them." She lifted her eyes to his, and the crowded room faded. For a moment, it was only the two of them, moving together in rhythm. The contract, the lies, the watching eyes, everything slipped away. She felt his steady hand at her back, the warmth of his palm enclosing hers, the closeness that sent her pulse racing. When the dance ended, applause rose around them. Emily's breath caught, and she realized she was smiling, truly smiling, not the forced smile of performance. Alexander's gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, his eyes searching hers as though questioning what he, too, was beginning to feel. That night, back in the car, Emily stared out the window at the city lights flashing by. She knew this was dangerous. The contract was clear. 2 weeks. Nothing more. But her heart betrayed her, beating faster whenever Alexander was near. And in the quiet, Alexander turned his head slightly, watching her reflection in the glass. He told himself this was still an act, a charade. Yet deep inside, a truth he had not prepared for was beginning to take root. The performance was working far too well. The following week brought a new kind of trial. Emily Carter had grown more confident in public, but confidence was fragile in a world determined to break her. At a dinner hosted by one of Alexander Pierce's business associates, the glitter of crystal glasses and polished silverware could not disguise the sharpness of the conversations. Every guest seemed to study her as if she were an exam they were eager to see her fail. Emily kept her composure, answering polite questions with the stories she and Alexander had rehearsed. She was calm, careful, almost convincing. But when the evening drew on, the questions became sharper. A woman at the table, elegant in a silver gown, leaned forward with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "So, Emily," the woman said sweetly, "tell us about your family. What do they do? Where did you attend school?" The table grew quiet. Emily felt her throat tighten. She had prepared for questions about her relationship with Alexander, not her own background. She thought of her mother lying in a hospital bed at St. Mary's Hospital, of her father who had walked away years ago, of the small cafe where she worked long shifts just to survive. None of it fit this polished room. "I grew up in Brooklyn," Emily said softly, her voice steady but quiet. "My mother is the strongest woman I know. She raised me on her own." The woman's smile sharpened. "So no prestigious schools? No high society upbringing?" A few guests exchanged glances. Emily's cheeks burned. But before she could speak, Alexander's voice cut through the air. "My wife's strength does not come from a family name or a bank account," he said firmly, his hand resting over Emily's beneath the table. "It comes from character, and character is something money cannot buy." The room stilled. For the first time that evening, Emily felt truly seen, not as a prop, but as a person. Yet the reprieve did not last. Later that night, as they left the dinner, a figure waited near the car. A man in a tailored suit, his smile cold, his eyes sharp with curiosity. Alexander's jaw clenched the moment he saw him. "Victor," Alexander muttered under his breath. The man's smile widened. "Alexander Pierce. Always a pleasure." "And who is this?" His gaze slid to Emily with unsettling interest. "Your wife. How unexpected." "Oh," Emily forced a polite smile, but the man's tone made her skin crawl. Victor leaned closer. "Funny, I do not recall ever hearing about this marriage," almost as if it appeared out of nowhere. Alexander's hand tightened around Emily's. His voice was calm but edged with steel. "Careful, Victor. You are speaking about my wife." Victor chuckled and stepped back. "Of course. My apologies. I look forward to learning more about this surprising union." "Oh." As they drove away, Emily's chest ached with unease. She turned to Alexander. "Who was that?" "An old rival," he said flatly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "And a man who will not stop until he finds a weakness." Emily shivered. The contract had seemed like a lifeline once. Now, it felt like a storm was closing in around them, and she wondered how long they could keep their fragile secret before it shattered completely. The day of Alexander Pierce's younger brother's wedding arrived with an energy that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Guests in elegant gowns and sharp tuxedos flooded into the cathedral, their voices blending into a hum of expectation. For Alexander and Emily Carter, this was supposed to be the final test, the moment when their performance would either convince everyone or unravel completely. Emily stood by his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm as photographers captured every angle. She wore a pale gown chosen by Alexander's personal stylist, a gown that shimmered beneath the stained glass light. On the surface, she looked like the perfect wife of a millionaire, but inside, her heart pounded with dread. As the ceremony gave way to the reception, the crowd grew louder, the music swelling. Emily smiled until her face ached, laughing politely at jokes, answering endless questions, clinging to the story they had rehearsed. Yet she could feel eyes on her, sharp and suspicious. And then, through the crowd, she saw Victor again. His presence was like a shadow in the room, a reminder of the secret she carried. Victor raised his glass in her direction, his smirk deliberate. Emily's stomach twisted. Something in his expression told her he knew, or at least suspected. Hours later, during the speeches, the inevitable happened. Victor stood with his glass, his voice smooth and mocking. "To Alexander Pierce and his lovely wife," he began, drawing out the words as if savoring them. "Such a whirlwind romance, is it not? Almost too sudden, too convenient." The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward Emily, and she felt heat flood her cheeks. Victor's gaze lingered on her, his smirk growing crueler. "Tell us, Emily," he said loudly. "How does it feel to marry into wealth so quickly? Quite the upgrade from a cafe waitress, was it not?" The words landed like knives. Emily froze, her mind spinning. She had told no one about her job, yet here he was, exposing her truth. Gasps spread across the room. Alexander rose instantly, his jaw tight. "Victor, that is enough." But Victor only chuckled. "Oh, Alexander, do not pretend. We all know appearances can be deceiving. A sudden marriage, a mysterious bride, a past that does not fit the story. Should we call it love? Or should we call it something else entirely?" Whispers rippled through the crowd, suspicion blooming like wildfire. Emily's throat closed, her eyes stinging. She wanted to disappear, to vanish from the judgment pressing in on her. She whispered to Alexander, her voice trembling. "They know. He knows. This was a mistake." "Oh!" Before Alexander could stop her, Emily pulled away and fled the ballroom, her heels clicking against the marble as she pushed through the doors into the night air. The music and chatter faded behind her, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Inside, Alexander stood frozen, torn between fury and fear. The contract was broken. The secret was out. And the woman he had sworn was only part of a transaction was slipping away from him into the dark. Emily Carter did not stop running until she reached the quiet courtyard behind the cathedral. Her chest heaved, her heart pounding louder than the music still echoing faintly from the ballroom. The night air was cold against her flushed skin, but it did nothing to cool the fire of humiliation burning inside her. She pressed her hands to her face, tears slipping through her fingers. The sound of footsteps followed, steady and deliberate. "Emily," Alexander Pierce's voice called, firm yet strained. She turned sharply, her eyes blazing. "Do not say my name like that. Not after what just happened. Do you understand what he did? He exposed me. He ripped me apart in front of everyone, and you," her voice cracked, "you could not protect me." Alexander froze, her words slicing through him deeper than Victor's cruelty ever could. "I tried. I stood up." "You stayed silent when it mattered most," Emily interrupted, her voice trembling. "You let them see me as nothing but a liar, as someone who did not belong in your world. Do you know how small I felt in there? Do you know what it is like to be pitied and judged because of where you come from?" Her tears glistened in the moonlight, and for the first time Alexander saw the weight of the pain she carried. He reached for her, but she stepped back. "I cannot do this anymore," she whispered. "I thought I could pretend, but every smile, every word feels like another chain. I am not your wife, Alexander. I am just a contract you needed to save face." The truth of her words struck him harder than any rival's insult. He had insisted to himself that this was only business, only strategy. But as he watched her trembling before him, he realized the lie he had been telling was not to the world, but to himself. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice unsteady for the first time. "You are more than that. You have always been more than that." "Oh." Her eyes closed against the ache in her chest. "Then why do I feel like less every time I stand beside you?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. She turned away, her steps slow but certain. "I need to leave. I need to go back to where I came from. To a place where I do not have to pretend to be someone I am not." Alexander reached out once more, but his hand fell to his side as she disappeared into the shadows of the courtyard. The driver found him minutes later, standing alone beneath the glow of the street lamp, his polished composure shattered. Emily Carter was gone, and for the first time in years, Alexander Pierce felt powerless. Back in her small apartment in Brooklyn, Emily collapsed onto her bed, her chest heavy with both relief and sorrow. She thought leaving would free her, but instead, the emptiness grew. She had escaped the charade, yet her heart betrayed her with every painful reminder of the man she was supposed to hate but could not stop loving. And in the quiet of the night, both Emily and Alexander faced the same truth. They had lost something real in the middle of a lie. The days that followed were filled with silence. Emily Carter returned to her small apartment in Brooklyn, back to the routine of long shifts at the cafe and late nights worrying over her mother's condition at St. Mary's Hospital. She told herself it was better this way, that she had walked away from a dangerous illusion. But her heart betrayed her every time she remembered the look on Alexander Pierce's face as she left him standing alone beneath the cathedral lights. Alexander, meanwhile, moved through his empire like a ghost. The business meetings continued, the deals were signed, but his focus fractured. For the first time, the mask he wore so well began to crack. His colleagues noticed the change, but no one dared to question it. Only he knew that the sharp emptiness inside him was not about business. It was about the woman who had walked out of his life carrying the piece of him he never admitted existed. 3 nights later, Alexander made his choice. He left the comfort of his penthouse and the glow of the city's tallest towers and drove through the narrow streets of Brooklyn until he stopped outside the cafe where Emily worked. Through the window, he saw her wiping down tables, her movements tired yet graceful. Customers trickled out until the lights dimmed, and she locked the door behind her. When she turned, she froze. Alexander stood there on the sidewalk, his presence cutting through the quiet street like a spotlight. Emily's breath caught. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling with both anger and something she refused to name. "I came for you," Alexander said simply. His tone carried no arrogance, only raw honesty. "I cannot let it end the way it did." Emily shook her head, clutching her bag tighter. "We had a contract, Alexander. That is all it was. It is over." He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "No, it stopped being a contract the moment I realized I cared more about your pain than my pride. I let you stand alone when you needed me most, and I will not make that mistake again." Her chest tightened, tears threatening to spill. "And what about your family? Your world? Do you really think they will accept someone like me?" Alexander's voice grew firm, steady. "I do not care if they accept it. I am done living by their rules. I am done pretending. What I want is real, and it is you." "Oh." With that, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the contract they had signed. Emily stared as he tore the pages into pieces, letting the scraps scatter into the wind. "No more contracts," he said, his voice breaking. "No more lies. I love you, Emily Carter. Not because of who I need you to be, but because of who you already are." Her tears fell freely now, the walls she had built trembling against the force of his words. For the first time, she saw him stripped of wealth and power, standing not as a millionaire but as a man pleading for forgiveness. And in that moment, Emily realized that despite everything, despite the pain and betrayal, her heart had never stopped loving him. The choice before her was terrifying, but the hope in his eyes ignited something warm inside her chest. The night was still, the broken pieces of paper fluttering at their feet, as Emily whispered the words that would change everything. "Then show me it is real." The following weeks became proof of promises kept. Alexander Pierce did not retreat into silence or pride as he once might have. Instead, he stood beside Emily Carter openly, no longer hiding her from the sharp eyes of his family or the watchful gaze of society. When whispers rose, he silenced them, not with threats, but with truth. He told anyone who questioned their marriage that Emily was not a convenient choice, nor a mistake, but the woman he loved. At first, his family resisted. His mother demanded explanations, his father questioned his judgment, and even his younger brother worried about scandal. But Alexander did not waver. He repeated his devotion again and again, until even the harshest skeptic began to see that this was not a game. Emily struggled too. She fought against the fear that she would never truly belong in his world. Yet each time doubt rose, Alexander's actions answered it. He accompanied her to St. Mary's Hospital, holding her mother's hand with respect. He visited the cafe where she once worked, shaking hands with her co-workers as if they were his equals. Slowly, Emily realized that love was not about where they came from, but about how they chose to walk forward together. Months later, In a smaller ceremony, far from the glare of the press, Emily walked down an aisle not as part of a contract but as a bride. The vows were simple, heartfelt, and true. Alexander's voice trembled when he promised, "No more masks, no more bargains, only love." Oh, when he slipped the ring onto her finger, Emily felt the circle close. The girl who once scribbled worries into a notebook had become the woman who now held the heart of a man who had once believed he could never be vulnerable. The applause rose, but for Emily and Alexander, the world had already faded. What began as a lie had become the truest thing either of them had ever known. And in that truth, they found not only love, but the justice of finally being accepted for who they really were.